Northern Territory Police Officer Zachary Rolfe had no choice but to shoot 19-year-old Yuendumu man Kumanjayi Walker to save his fellow officer's life, the constable's defense barrister has told his trial. Key points. Constable Rolfe has pleaded not guilty to all charges over the fatal of 19-year-old Kumanjayi Walker in November 2019. Constable Rolfe has pleaded not guilty to all charges over the fatal of 19-year-old Kumanjayi Walker in November 2019. Barrister David Edwardson QC said Constable Rolfe was charged before a proper investigation took place. Barrister David Edwardson QC said Constable Rolfe was charged before a proper investigation took place. The jury is expected to begin deliberations on Thursday. Warning: Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander readers are advised that this article contains an image of a person who has used with the permission of their family. Constable Rolfe, 30, has pleaded not guilty to, and two alternative charges, over the of Mr. Walker in the remote Central Australian community in 2019. The officer fired his Glock pistol 3 times after the 19-year-old stabbed him in the shoulder with a pair of scissors, as he and his partner, Constable Adam Ebel, tried to arrest him inside a house. Tragically, he had no choice, Mr. Edwardson said. Constable Rolfe had to pull the trigger or risk the real possibility that Constable Ebel would or could be fatally stabbed. Constable Rolfe's first shot, which was fired when Mr. Walker was standing and struggling with Constable Ebel, was not the subject of any charges. But prosecutors say the second and third shots were not legally justified because by then Constable Ebel had effectively restrained Mr. Walker on the ground. Mr. Edwardson said Constable Rolfe was doing his job reasonably and in good faith. Mr. Edwardson told the jury his client's split-second, intuitive decision to fire his weapon was in line with police training that dictates officers should draw and potentially use their firearm if threatened with an edged weapon. Each time he pulled the trigger, Constable Rolfe was acting in good faith, he was acting in a reasonable performance of his duties, and he was acting in self-defense, the self-defense of himself and his partner, he said. Kumanjayi Walker, author of his own misfortune, defense says. Mr. Edwardson told the jury it appeared the prosecution believed Mr. Walker should have been treated with kid gloves, despite the fact he had threatened other officers with an axe 3 days before. Mr. Walker was dangerous, he was violent, and in many respects, he was the author of his own misfortune, he said. Mr. Edwardson asked the jury to consider body-worn camera footage of the in real time rather than frame by frame, which he said distorted the reality of Constable Rolfe's actions. The barrister was highly critical of key prosecution witness and senior NT police officer Andrew Barham, who previously told the court Mr. Walker's arm was pinned beneath him when the second and third shots were fired. Kumanjayi Walker was fatally shot by Constable Rolfe in Yuendumu in 2019. But Mr. Edwardson said it was impossible to see Mr. Walker's right arm on the body-worn camera footage. We say that Senior Sergeant Barham is neither credible nor reliable, he told the court. He is simply a mouthpiece for the executive, and has no doubt been wheeled in here in justification for this investigation. Mr. Edwardson also dismissed the prosecution's claim that Constable Rolfe had tried to justify the unjustifiable by formulating a lie moments after the. In the body-worn footage, Constable Rolfe can be heard telling his partner, "It's all good, he's got scissors in his hand. He was stabbing me, he was stabbing you." Mr. Edwardson told the jury, those words were not, as the prosecution would have you believe, a lie made out of consciousness of guilt, but rather a graphic and clear description of exactly what Zachary Rolfe believed had happened to both officers at the hands of this high-risk, violent offender. In his address, Mr. Edwardson also delivered a scathing attack on the NT police decision to lay the charge against Constable Rolfe 4 days after describing it as a disgrace. He said no proper investigation, or meaningful investigation, had occurred before the charges were laid. The executive of the NT police force and those they deployed to justify these charges, you might think, have thrown everything at Zachary Rolfe because of a decision that should never have been made, he said. In truth, this prosecution is, you might think, all about the executive of the Northern Territory Police Force attempting to justify what was unjustifiable. He said the prosecution had failed to negate any of the legal defenses put forward by Constable Rolfe's legal team. In these circumstances, there can be only one verdict, and that is one of not guilty to all charges, he told the jury. Crown says second and third shots were not justified. Earlier on Wednesday, Crown Prosecutor Philip Strickland SC finished his closing address by telling the jury there were two ways it could find Constable Rolfe's second and third shots were not legally justified. Mr. Strickland said some evidence was extremely damaging to Constable Rolfe's credibility. The first way, he said, was if they believed Constable Rolfe knew that Constable Ebel had effectively restrained Mr. Walker by the time those shots were fired. The Crown case is that at that time he believed the threat had been removed, but nevertheless, Constable Rolfe was kept regardless, he said. The second way, he said, was if the jury believed Constable Rolfe failed to adequately assess the situation. If you find that Constable Rolfe didn't assess the risk at all, then you would not find that he actually had a belief that Constable Ebel was at risk of serious harm or, he said. And you would not find that his response in firing those two fatal shots, at point-blank range, was a reasonable response as he perceived it. Mr. Strickland conceded that if the jury accepted Constable Rolfe's version, that he had seen Mr. Walker stabbing his partner in the chest and neck and feared for his life, then they could only deliver one verdict. If you believe, as a reasonable possibility, that evidence is true, you must find him not guilty on all three counts, no question about it, Mr. Strickland said. But the prosecutor pointed to several examples, which he said undermined Constable Rolfe's credibility. The jury is expected to retire to consider its verdict on Thursday. He said at no time did the vision show Mr. Walker stabbing Constable Ebel in the chest or neck region. He also noted Constable Rolfe's claim that Mr. Walker had tried to grab his firearm during the initial struggle was not mentioned to any other officers after that. That is because that never happened. He made it up, Mr. Strickland said. And if you accept that, that is extremely damaging to your assessment of whether you believe Constable Rolfe's evidence that he saw Kumanjayi Walker stabbing Constable Ebel in the neck area and in the chest area while he's on the mattress. The trial continues tomorrow, when Judge John Burns is expected to summarize the case before the jury retires to consider its verdict.